Hello, I'm Soycam, welcome back to the second channel video. So today is officially the date that New Caledonia decides if it wants to become the world's newest independent country or if it's going to remain a part of France. This is of course an independence referendum and you don't get too many of these, so it's kind of a big deal. So let's talk about the November the 4th referendum happening in New Caledonia right now. And the immediate first flag here is like, wait, November the 4th? That's right, even though the video you're watching might say November the 3rd, your time might even say that if you're watching this when it's new. New Caledonia is one of those interesting parts of France that despite, France being the hexagon just over here, France is a huge country all over the world on most of the continents, and because of that fact, arguably all of them if you count it in different ways, but because of that fact, this is not all of their territories, by the way, it's missing Wallis and Futuna, but because of that fact, New Caledonia is all the way found to the east here. It's named after Scotland. New Caledonia is Latin for New Scotland, and or Latin for Scotland with New put before it, and it's next to Australia and its other big countries nearby, New Zealand and Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. You might question, what's the deal with this island right here? Like, it's next to Australia, it's named after Scotland, but it's a French collectivity that wants independence, maybe? That seems like a story, because if we're being entirely honest, most people don't think about New Caledonia all the time. It's a very, it's not a hugely densely populated country. There's only 300,000 people that live there, and again, it's in the least populated continent, very, very far away from the rest of the world, but it is a hugely interesting place, and to get you interested in case you're like, I don't know if I agree with this hugely interesting place thing, first of all, let me show you just some random scenery from the place. It looks super beautiful and a little bit alien, right? Like, it's super orange. That has something to do with the country's independence. And then second of all, they've got a really nice flag, in my opinion, and this also has something to do with the country's independence vote, which, again, I think it's interesting that, like, two beautiful separate things are actually related, because here's the deal, right? They're having an independence referendum today, but it's not very likely to head towards independence, because New Caledonia is a French colony, which was originally, before the French settled it, and before the British found it, and before all these different things, it was settled for, over 2,000 years now by the Canuck people. So the Canuck people is how it's spelt, but these people, they settled onto the island, and they are generally in favor of becoming an independent territory, of getting their sovereignty back, of becoming in control of their own destinies, whereas the French people are not. And this, over time, as it turns out, empires get less popular. What used to be the French Empire is now a lot of places that choose to be under French control to various extents with their own elections and so on and so forth. So because of said less favor of, colonization and less favor sort of things, a lot of compromises have been made with the native people to make, kind of like as an appeasement process. So the first, thing that happened most recently was in the 1980s. Their flag changed, so they represented the native peoples. This is a flag that shows the diversity of the people of New Caledonia. Again, I think, regardless what you think about diversity of people in New Caledonia, super good flag. So good compromise in my opinion. If you get a nice flag out of a compromise, everyone's a winner there. And the second thing is a lot of money has been funneling in from France to the colony. In fact, depending on how you measure it, because obviously there's indirect, France fuels people there, but do their wages count as a subsidy? But between a seventh and a fifth of the island's economy comes from France fueling subsidies, indirectly into the country. So, yeah, because of that, and the big thing that they do there, economically speaking, is nickel mining, which is why it has to do with this. The reason the country is so orange is because they're a huge nickel mining hub. In fact, actually, I said you probably don't think about New Caledonia too much at the start of the video. If you work in the nickel business, you probably think about them all the time, because a lot of the world's nickels come from here, which is gonna factor into what we're talking about later. So yeah, New Caledonia, this country, has the kind of traditional struggle of there's a native population, there's a larger set of population, what do you do about that exactly? And in the case of New Caledonia, it's not quite as clear-cut as everywhere else, because you get the divide which looks a lot more contentious. As you can see, Canuck people are slightly, they're the largest, it's called the plurality in English, plurality in American English, and it's called a non-absolute majority in, I believe, British English. Fun fact, look into that sometime. But they're the largest single group, but they're not the majority. 40.3%, again, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, this terrible look at the quality of this, by the way, but according to them, in 2009, 40%, 2 in 5 people are Canuck people, with around, a third of people being European, i.e. mostly French, but grouping them all together because Europeans or whatever. Then there's the Wallis and Futuna, which is another colony that used to be linked here. We'll get into that later. And then there's a lot of other groups making up the remainder because, again, there's a lot of people from a lot of different areas who move here for various business reasons because of said nickel mining industry. So yeah, now that we've gone that out of the way, you can kind of understand why there's a lot of tensions here. When you look at most countries where the original settler population was kind of displaced, for instance, New Zealand with the Maori people, it's like, oh yeah, so there's a huge imbalance there. You kind of work out some, accord between the two. You think about Australia, you think about maybe America, who has maybe a questionable record on that one, but it's a story you hear all over the world where it's like, okay, well, there's a larger settler population. What do you do about that? But in New Caledonia, it's more of an interesting struggle of seeing two different populations with entirely diametrically opposed views. In the European settlers' views, it's like, this is a part of France. Why would we not be a part of France? They funnel money into us, etc., etc., etc. In the view of the native people, again, represented by this flag so wonderfully, it's like, hey, this was our land for about 2,500 years before you came, in the last couple hundred years and took it over, and why don't we get to have our own country based around that? But the interesting thing about this is, okay, there's a referendum, now you know both sides, what's going to happen? Oh, anything could happen, let's wait for the polls. Again, in about 24 hours we will know. But the thing is, we don't have to wait 24 hours to know. There's been a lot of polling about this, and pretty much every poll gives a margin of about 40% to 50%, 30 to 50% in favor of not going independent. Because here's the thing, looking at this map right here, there is a decent number of them Canucks, or Canucks, whatever, which way you want to say it, but there's a decent, number of them who do want to be independent. It's like, yeah, let's show that we're not just a, French colony, we are our own independent nation with our own independent traditions, etc. But the truth is, every other, group combined are all like, well, it's people invested in being independent and people invested in, well, let's just have the best economic option. And that is why the referendum is very, very unlikely to succeed. There has been a referendum before. They had a referendum on whether they should have referendums. And in fact, after this, because France is slowly agreeing over the next, they've got a long timeline laid out, they're going to slowly be less and less colonial towards it. And, that's why they've got 2 more referendums planned already. Because of that fact, there's no urgency to this. There's no urgency saying we have to become independent right now or we're going to leave, which means that so there's a common thing in referendums where the status quo always gets a boost at the end. The big exceptions to this are like, Brexit, for instance. But most referendums where you see it's like 50-50, eventually it will swing back the other way. Again, Brexit happened to swing like 2%. And everyone's like, oh, it's such a big shock, a 2% error of margin. But this is a poll where it's literally 2/3 of respondents mostly are responding every single time saying, no, we'll stay a part of France. There's just too many good reasons and there's other referendums coming. And that's why New Caledonia, it's an interesting story of a country that is going to exist sometime, but it's not going to exist just now. Although, it is worth noting, it is on the UN list of non-self-governing territories. Basically, the UN has a list. On their website, by the way, this is the official UN website. Looks pretty terrible. Maybe someone upped the funding for their website. But basically they have a page on their website where they just call out the UK, France, and the US for their various colonies, as well as Western Sahara, but that's a whole separate thing. As you can see, on said list, you'll see French Polynesia, same problem. New Caledonia, exactly the same problem. So, yeah, long story short here, New Caledonia is going to have a vote. You're going to hear about the results in 24 hours. Everyone's going to act shocked because, oh, they decided to be a part of France still. What a shocker. Wow, they voted against independence. And it's just because it doesn't make sense now, in terms of economically speaking. Most of the people on the island, again, you need to build a coalition of people beyond just the nationalism of your own group. And that's currently something that the side is not really, maybe they're not aiming to do it, maybe they're just not doing a very good job, but that is the problem in New Caledonia. There are a lot of valid reasons, by the way, in every colonial struggle, like, man, the people who went in here, again, especially early colonial days, lots of awful things happened. I want to get out of the way before someone's like, hey, Toycat, don't you understand? Because terrible things happen, they deserve to be independent. Just because terrible things happened in the past, you can't try and correct them by overcorrecting now, Like, becoming independent now doesn't fix any atrocities. It makes them worse because everyone gets a lot poorer because France will slowly pull out the funding. And even though they've agreed they'll do it slowly, if New Caledonia becomes independent, they still are going to have to pull out the funding of something that's not theirs anymore. If New Caledonia... I've never had my voice literally die in the middle of a sentence like that before. Apologies. But here's the problem with New Caledonia and the independence movement. So, again, let me clarify. This isn't me saying this is some great colonial overlord. I know I live in the UK and, oh yeah, look, we're on this list a bunch. I think the most, actually. And, oh yeah, therefore, you're just trying to defend colonialism. No, I'm not trying to defend colonialism. I'm saying you can't overcorrect that. And even if you do think, okay, the best solution to the atrocities that have been committed over X period is to, 1, go straight into terrorism, because there's a lot of hostage taking, etc. that used to happen before they agreed on these accords, which is why they can have so many referendums on basically no threshold. But the problem is even if you think it's the right solution to that, which I think is a very questionable thing, like having independence, that's not the solution. It's just a form of nationalism. So, the same thing people hate on the right wing, this is just a form of, anti-colonialism nationalism. It's not a solution. But if you think it is, let's go with that. Then the problem is like, well, what are you actually gaining by being independent? The problem is because the people do not have a majority right now. That they're going to have an independent government which does not vote for their things. Like if you're the minority in a country, voting to become independent does not solve that. And even if let's say magically it did, it's like just making your own decisions doesn't make things great. And then where do you draw the lines of like, okay, then so what we have to do is we have to separate the French people into a separate territory. We've seen before that doesn't work. You can't unlike gerrymander, if you will, a territory like that. And then they also raise the question of like, how low down does the sovereignty go? A fun fact you might not know is that Wallis and Petunia, because New Caledonia is one of the overseas collectivities of France. So it's on the second layer of delegation. They're receiving more and more powers. They're not just there's some places in the world, like French Guiana, this part right here, this is just, French Guiana. It is literally just a part of France. It's not like, oh yeah, it's a country that France kind of owns. No, it's just France has some departments over there. They have a department here. If you look at one of my favorite maps to this day, by the way, is the number of Eiffel Towers in every South American country. Technically correct. But it's like that's France's thing, right? They use the euro, etc., etc. These countries, they use it's called the CFP franc. They have their own extra powers already. And funnily enough, Wallis and Petunia used to be a part of New Caledonia. They voted to secede. What is to stop that being a continuous thing on that level? And even if you do become independent, you do have your own power, you do have the governments, the big issue that most people see is that New Caledonia is a tiny country with a lot of natural resources. They're going to start exploiting those resources on a serious level once they become independent, and they're going to fall under the power of some local, so whether it's Australia that takes them under their wing, or whether it's China, because China is big on like neo-colonialism, if you want to call it that. But China's big on, trying to get countries on their side. So they're just going to become you can't really have independence when you're that small to some extent, Like at least being under France's wing, France funnels a bunch of money in. You're on the good end of that. Like, you say you're France in some specific ways, and there's kind of, like things that happen on the other side. But yeah, New Caledonia isn't going to become independent. The reasons for it is just doesn't make much sense beyond the nationalism argument. And it's worth noting nationalism is super strong in New Caledonia. And I don't just mean, oh yeah, so the Canucks. I looked into it. That's how you say it, but I know that's how you say a type of Canadian too. So I'm sorry if you don't like the Canuck thing. But so the Canuck people, they're very nationalist. They vote. They want to have the independence for that reason. But it's also worth noting the French people on the island are also super nationalist, and that in New Caledonia they vote for the French president because he's president of all of France. That's right, Emmanuel Macron. He's president over here and over there too. But the interesting thing is, I know this is uninhabited by the way, but the interesting thing is that they vote in those referendums, and Marie Le Pen, the FN, the Front National, the National Front in English, they were the most voted party in the first round. So it's worth noting the French people are very nationalist there. The the New Caledonian natives, the Canuck people, very nationalist as well. And I think the easy solution is let's try and calm that down somehow. That's what the referendum is going to show. It's going to show 2/3 one side, 1/3 the other. How about we try and all settle this stuff out? How about we agree, okay, there's no majority for independence, but maybe we can work some stuff out where we both get a bit of happy, and that's what the debate has to be about afterwards. So yeah, New Caledonia, let me just say the headlines from tomorrow, doesn't vote to become independent country. It's not the newest UN member state, because it does have to apply for that as well, but it is an interesting example to raise the question about what does independent country really mean? And yeah, New Caledonia, fun fact for you all right there. It's worth noting actually, just while we're in the same area, because French territories, I really want to make a French empire video just talking about overseas collectivity sometimes, because France very much holds on to every semblance of the empire they can. And again, I know I'm from the UK, so that's somewhat hypocritical to mention. But interestingly enough, Vanuatu actually went independent from France in the 1980s. It's France's most recent colony that went independent. So previously, Vanuatu was on this list. Now it's not on this list anymore. And interestingly enough, they went independent and they did do really well, but they're still doing horrifically compared to New Caledonia. They have a similar population, but almost 1/10 the GDP. New Caledonia is quite a rich country. Vanuatu is doing above the average for a Pacific island, but still not great. So just an interesting side note right there. Also, New Caledonia is surrounded by English-speaking countries, or Anglophone, or English because of colonial reason, countries. Like there's New Zealand, Australia, Solomon Islands, Fiji. Like, it's literally all four sides. So it means that they don't do trade locally. In most parts of the world, local trade is one of the biggest factors. That's why Canada trades so much with the US, and the US trades so much with Mexico, despite that being a whole thing. But in this region of the world, there's just not much business they can do with their neighbors, for a lot of different reasons. I mean, it's also worth noting they're not actually very geographically close. Like, it's still over 1,000 kilometers to get to Australia, one of their closest big neighbors. So, anyway, just interesting thing. This part of the world's weird because it's islands, and because most of the islands are English-based, and New Caledonia's not. Which means it would be an interesting country if it does somehow, by an extreme fluke, vote for independence. Oh, also before we go, I don't deny that eventually New Caledonia will become independent. There'll be some reason eventually. Again, they've got a lot of these referendums planned. France has basically committed, like, sure, go independent one day, but for now, it doesn't make sense for you or for us. But, 2018, November the 4th, don't think it's happening. If it does happen, I'll be embarrassed, but I'm 100% sure it's not. So, 99.9% sure, because when polls go wrong, this is really, really key stuff, actually. Everyone doesn't trust opinion polls. Opinion polls are a solid science. People just need to understand there's a margin of error, and they're also, percentages. Like, it's like the famous, Donald Trump, Hillary thing and Brexit. The polls both got them wrong. The polls said there was a higher chance of the other event happening. But you know what? If I roll a dice right now, I've got an obsidian cube right here. If let's say this was a dice, it doesn't. If it's like, oh yeah, you probably won't roll 6. You can still roll 6s. Do you know that's how that works? Anyway, so look into opinion polling sometime. It's a fascinating science. I'd love the whole video just opinion polling, but I know that the referendum series on this channel is one of the lesser popular, or maybe it's not. But let me know what you think. More referendum style videos, because I love talking about referendums. I could do it all day. But thank you very much for watching this video, and second channel, don't care. Goodbye. By the way, it's so beautiful. Anyway, yeah, bye.